In December, at the request of General Eisenhower, the Liberation Committee sent the first units of the French Expeditionary Corps to Italy. He gradually strengthened and finally provided decisive support to the Allies in the battles for the capture of Rome. As our participation in the war effort increased, we became louder in the field of politics. This was simply necessary. After all, the Anglo-Saxons, applying to Italy a system of all kinds of tricks, and trying to preserve the power of King Victor Emmanuel and Marshal Badoglio, thus put obstacles to Franco-Italian reconciliation and themselves created the preconditions for revolution on the Peninsula. In 1940, with the connivance of the king, Italy declared war on France, just at the moment when our country fell under the onslaught of German hordes, and it was France in bloody battles liberated Italy in 1859 and ensured its unification. In 1917, the French army helped to stop the retreat of Italian troops at the Piave River after the defeat at Caporetto. The king accepted and tolerated Mussolini's rule until events dared the deuce. Badoglio, taking advantage of the German victory, forced the commissioners Pétain and Weygand to sign an armistice, by virtue of which the Italians occupied part of the French territory and controlled the armed forces of our empire. Moreover, it was the fascist regime that showered the prime minister, a marshal, with honours and gave him the post of commander-in-chief. How could such a monarch and such a head of government realize the cooperation of his country with our country and lead Italy on a new path? On January 22, 1944, the Liberation Committee reported all this to Washington, London and Moscow, declaring that changes were needed in Italy, both on the throne and in the government. In March, May and June I was myself in Italy inspecting our troops, and I noticed many disturbing signs in the country, especially in Naples. I observed there the picture of extreme poverty, and saw what a deplorable effect on the morale of the population is produced by contact with the well-fed, well-clothed, well-supplied occupiers. As a Christian, as a Latin, as a European, I suffered cruelly to see the plight of a great people, to whom delusion had led astray from the right path, but to whom the world owed so much. Perhaps the Italian crowd instinctively guessed my feelings. It may be that in days of bitter trial it turned its hopes to France, as is common to unhappy countries. At any rate, as soon as I appeared in the street, people flocked to me to my great surprise and greeted me enthusiastically. Our representative, Cove de Merville, who had extensive and reliable information, gave me a picture of the political situation in Italy, which was torn by contradictory currents, for it was already felt that the fate of the country would be decided by the struggle between communism and the influence of the Pope. During my visits to Italy I had to give up, with some regret, my meetings with Umberto Badoglio. Indeed, I could not reconcile myself to the fact that the prince's father still wore the crown and Marshal Badoglio was still head of government. But while in the West, on the shores of the Mediterranean, we had already begun to reap the fruits of a long effort, in the East we had to suffer great distress. In the states of the Levant, a crisis had been created by the efforts of local politicians, and England had taken advantage of it by wishing to capitalize, before it was too late, on the weakening of France's strength. This time the field of action was Lebanon. In July 1943, elections took place there. After the unfortunate events that had so undermined the prestige of France, the new Lebanese parliament, of course, showed unbridled nationalism. The British, whose intervention had greatly influenced the outcome of the elections, now wanted to take advantage of this. Next to Bahar el-Khoury, elected President of the Republic, and Prime Minister Riyad Sohl, the figure of Spears, a clear opponent of France, now loomed, who sought to inflate his own price and promised Lebanon the patronage of England under all circumstances. It must be said that the actions of Spears in Syria and Lebanon were in line with the general line of policy which Britain conceived to lead in the East in the last period of the war. Thanks to the victorious operations in Africa, the British have released numerous troops. Part of them were sent to fight in Italy, and the other positioned on both sides of the Red Sea. 700,000 British soldiers occupied Egypt, Sudan, Cyrenaica, Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, and the Levant. In addition, London created in Cairo an economic centre, and thanks to credit machinations, monopoly in the field of transport, powerful blocs, this organization held in its hands the entire foreign trade of the Arab countries, that is, in fact, the entire life of the population, determined the opinion of prominent figures and the position of the government. And finally, the presence in these countries of a whole army of specialists, widely supplied with financial means, the penetration of the English into the highest circles, the influence of diplomacy and perfectly organized propaganda, all this increased England's influence. Freed in the East from the threat of enemy invasion, it expected to establish itself there as the sole suzerain. We were unable to resist such an onslaught. 3 battalions of Senegalese, a few cannon, a few tanks, 2 Vest ships, a dozen airplanes, that's all the French armed forces in the Levant. True, to this we must add Syrian and Lebanese troops, that is, 18,000 good soldiers under our command. But how will they behave if the governments in Damascus and Beirut take an unequivocally hostile attitude toward us? Besides, our extreme poverty made it impossible for us to offer anything to anyone. And of course, it would have been impossible for us to fight against the flood of tendentious information which, if anything, all the Anglo-Saxon agencies would have spread all over the world. And above all, most important of all, the liberation of France was already looming on the horizon, and I was not willing on any account, by any means whatsoever, to lead the French, beginning with my ministers, to any other end. In general, we were too weak and too absorbed in our main task to attempt to suppress on the spot every possible encroachment on the French position. This is what happened in November. At Beirut, for reasons of internal order, which caused opposition in Parliament, the government was in an extremely difficult position. As a diversion, Riyad Sohl, President of the Council of Ministers, and Camille Chamoun, Minister of Foreign Affairs, made thunderous demands for a power with a mandate for Lebanon. Our general delegate to the Levant, Ambassador Jean Eliou, seeing the crisis approaching, went to Algiers to notify the government of everything. On November 5th, he made a report to me in the presence of Catrous and Masigli, and received instructions from us. He was invited to throw off the ballast in the storm to begin negotiations at Beirut, and at Damascus with a view to transfer to the local governments some of the economic and administrative rights hitherto held by the French authorities. At the same time, Eliou saw that in principle we shared his attitude and believed that the mandate entrusted to France by the League of the Nation could only be surrendered by her to future international instances, and that only a French government, which would no longer be a provisional power, could do so. This has been our position, and we have repeatedly made it known to the Allies, particularly to England, and have never received from her any objection in principle. If, legally, the independence of Syria and Lebanon was internationally recognized, it was because we ourselves gave it to them by virtue of our mandate. But by the same token, we have now had to bear some responsibility for the situation in Lebanon arising from the state of war that has engulfed the world. Mindful of the tragic calamities now being experienced by humanity, we thought that the governments of Damascus and Beirut could wait with their claims until the end of the war, at which time the last formalities that still limit the sovereignty of those states would be settled. No doubt both Syria and Lebanon would have waited had London not encouraged their claims and offered to impose them on us with the support of British troops. While Eliot was in Algiers, the Lebanese parliament amended the text of the constitution of the country, throwing out just what had to do with the mandate, as if it had been abolished. When our ambassador, returning to his post, was passing through Cairo, he informed the Lebanese government at Beirut that he was carrying a directive from the French government to begin negotiations, and asked for a delay in the proclamation of the new constitutional law. But Lebanon did not reckon with this. Returning to Beirut, Eliou, indignant at such provocative actions, on November 12th, he vetoed the constitution, dissolved the parliament, and arrested the Lebanese head of state, the president of the Council of Ministers, and several ministers, while Emile Edi became provisional president of the Republic. considering the measures taken by our delegate to be quite justified, and, above all, the sentiments by which they were motivated, the Liberation Committee, however, came to the conclusion that LU had gone beyond the limits of action permissible in the situation. All the more so because, without abandoning the mandate in principle, we did not intend to violate the independence already granted to the country. Therefore, on the morning of November 13th, having received information about the events that had taken place the previous day in Beirut, we decided to send General Catra there and instructed him to restore the normal constitutional situation, without, however, disavowing Eliu's actions. This meant that Catra, after conferring in Beirut, would order the release of Bahar el-Khari, Riyad Sol and their ministers and restore the president to his rights. That would be followed by changes in the composition of the Lebanese government and, last but not least, the convening of the Chamber of Deputies. As far as our delegate was concerned, his presence in Lebanon was no longer meaningful, since Catra had been sent there with the appropriate authority. We decided to summon Eliu to Algiers in a few days for consultation. In order to make it clear to everyone what mission Catra had been sent on, I personally delivered a soothing declaration to the Consultative Assembly on November 16th. What has happened in Lebanon, I declared, will in no way affect the policy which France is pursuing there, nor the commitments we have made, nor our firm intention to keep them. We want a normal constitutional order in Lebanon, so that we may discuss our common affairs with the Lebanese government, and so that this discussion may take place in full independence. Both his and ours, and I concluded by saying a gathering cloud will not darken the horizon. The next day, Catra, passing through Cairo, saw Kazi, the English Minister of State, and informed him that Khoury and Riyad Sol would soon be released. On November 19th, arriving at Beirut, he had a conversation with Bahar el-Khari, listened to the president's warm assurances as to his friendly feelings toward France, and informed him that he would soon be released from detention and return to his post. After this, no one could doubt our good desire to calm passions as soon as possible and to come to a reconciliation. But English policy was not satisfied with such a solution. One might have thought that London was deliberately adding fuel to the fire and wishing to suggest that we were not trying to settle the clash with Lebanon of our own free will, but through the energetic intervention of England. Was it not also a desire to spite de Gaulle for the recent change in the composition of the Liberation Committee? Already on November 13th, Meekins, who was replacing the absent Macmillan, went to Massigli and handed him a verbal, but formidable note demanding the immediate convening of an Anglo-French-Lebanese conference to settle the incident, and stating that, in the opinion of the English government, we must recall Eliot. And on November 19th, when it was already clear to everyone that the path we had chosen was the path to an agreement, England suddenly began to throw thunder and lightning. Of course, this could only have been done for the gallery and with the intention of humiliating France. On this day, Kazi arrived at Beirut, appeared accompanied by General Spears, before General Catra, and presented him with a very real ultimatum, without the slightest thought of the alliance which united us, and of the commitments made by England, in which she declared her political disinterestedness in the states of the Levant, forgetting the agreements with me which Oliver Littleton had signed on her behalf. England now demanded of the representative of France that he should agree to the convening of a tripartite conference, and that within 36 hours she should grant freedom to the President and ministers of the Lebanese Republic. Otherwise, the English, under the pretext of maintaining order, which was not their business at all, they were going to declare the country, as they said, under martial law, seize power by force, and send their troops to liberate by any means possible the prisoners whom our soldiers were guarding. So we are back to the days of Fashoda. General Catra replied to Kazi and Spears. True, there was a small difference in the days of Fashoda. France had the possibility of reaching armed conflict with England, and now England was in no such danger. The Liberation Committee ordered General Catra to withdraw from the tripartite conference, to release, as agreed, President Bahar el-Khari and his ministers, and if England carried out her threat to seize power in Lebanon, to collect our officials and our troops in one of the ports and transport them to Africa. I take it upon myself then to explain to France and to the world the reasons for the departure of our men. Eventually, a sort of modus vivendi was restored in Lebanon. The English quieted down a little. General Catroux negotiated with Damascus and Beirut for the transfer of institutions of public importance to either state. The rulers continued to hesitate and bargain, and those who aspired to their place agitated against them. The leaders of the neighboring Arab countries, for the same ulterior reasons, made noisy protests against France. In Cairo, the demands came from Neyahas Pasha, whom the English ambassador had imposed on King Farouk as chairman of the Council of Ministers in Baghdad from Nouri Said, who had returned to power only through the influence of British troops in Amman from Emir Abdullah, whose budget was drawn up in London, and whose army was commanded by General Peake and Colonel Glab, called Peake Pasha and Glab Pasha. In February, Catroux returned to Algiers. The Committee of Liberation appointed General Bainet General and plenipotentiary representative of France in the Levant. Eliou did not return there. Kazi left Cairo, and Chamaun left Beirut. Spears sat in his seat and prepared another crisis. Acting with great skill and firmness, the new French representative rectified the situation. However, it became quite clear that it is not possible to constantly fight such battles, showing in them all new wonders of strategy. All the more so because both our modest forces, and the sorrowful passions of the French, and the attention of the whole world, were now absorbed in something greater: military action, on which depended the fate of Europe. Here politics was even ahead of events. All its considerations were now directed to what would follow the victory. In the camp of the Allies, it was the middle and small states that first of all became agitated. Only the echoes of the debates of which they were the subject reached us in Algeria, for their kings and ministers were in London. Their diplomats tried to act chiefly in Washington, and they carried on their propaganda most of all in the Anglo-Saxon countries. Yet we knew them well enough to understand their anxieties. Incidentally, their anxiety was a clear and sad proof that the fall of France, and the present intention of the other three great powers to keep her at bay, would tomorrow weigh heavily on the terms of the peace which was already being prepared. In truth, Belgium and Luxembourg, having good neighbours in the West, had no doubt that their former boundaries and independence would also be restored after liberation. They had only economic problems to face, from ruined France, and from England, which itself had suffered a lot. They could not expect help soon. In the near future, they were counting on America. Therefore Spag, Gut, and Beche were seen at Atlantic City, and at Hot Springs, and at Dumbarton Oaks. In short, at all the conferences where the plans of the United States for the supply, reconstruction, and development of Europe were being formulated, while Roma, the Belgian ambassador to the French Liberation Committee, was chiefly interested in projects relating to the Confederation of Western Europe. Nor were the Dutch politically concerned about their metropolis, but they were very anxious about the fate of their possessions in Melanesia. Even then, America was putting pressure on the Dutch government, and in the future would force it to give up its dominant position in Java, Sumatra, and Borneo. From the words of the Dutch envoy Van Wyck, as well as from the reports sent to us from London de Jane, it was evident that Van Cleffens bitterly predicted that the victory of the Allies in the Pacific would entail the liquidation of the Dutch Empire. And the Norwegians already felt as if they felt how through neutral Sweden and defeated Finland they were being pressed by the crushing weight of all Russia. Treugevlei was already creating a plan of Atlantic Union, about which we talked to the Norwegian ambassador in Algeria, Horgan, but most of all the concern was shown by the emigrant governments of Central Europe and the Balkans. They foresaw that the expulsion of the Germans would be followed by the arrival of Soviet troops in their countries, and they feared for their future. The conference that took place in Tehran in December 1943 only increased their fears. Of course, the conference participants Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill did not skimp on reassuring declarations and claimed that they met to discuss strategic issues. However, the leaked information was by no means comforting for the émigré governments. Contrary to official secrets, they ferreted out the most significant of what was going on in Tehran. Stalin spoke there as a man entitled to demand an account. Without revealing to the other two participants in the conference the Russian plans, he succeeded in getting them to outline their plans to him and to amend them according to his demands. Roosevelt joined him in rejecting Churchill's idea of a broad offensive by Western military forces through Italy, Yugoslavia, and Greece toward Vienna, Prague, and Budapest. On the other hand, the Americans, in agreement with the Soviets, rejected, despite the insistence of the British, the proposal that the conference should consider political questions concerning Central Europe, and especially the question of Poland, where the Russian armies were about to enter. We French were kept out of all these affairs, and to such an extent that when Churchill and Roosevelt were on their way to Tehran, one in an airplane over the French possessions of North Africa and the other along its shores, both of them did not think of making contact with us. And so the prospects which had so frightened the monarchs and ministers of the Danubian, Privyslavlian and Balkan countries were now more clearly defined. Thus, in Greece, a considerable part of the elements of the resistance, who had fallen under the influence of the communists, formed the United Organization (EM), which aimed to fight against the invaders, and at the same time, to pave the way for revolution. Elas, the military organization of the movement, united many guerrilla units operating in the mountains of Greece, and also penetrated deeply into the army and navy formations stationed in the Middle East. In order to keep in touch with soldiers and sailors more easily, and to communicate with the interior of the country, Prime Minister Tsadarros and most of the ministers chose Cairo as their residence. King George II soon travelled there as well, but upon his arrival, a violent crisis erupted. In April 1944, Tsadarros had to resign. Venizelos, who replaced him, was also forced to resign. Papandreou managed to form a government with great difficulty, and just at this time, serious mutinies began in military units and on ships. To quell them required nothing more, nothing less, than the bloody intervention of British troops. Although the representatives of all the political currents of Greece, meeting afterwards in Beirut, proclaimed the slogan of national unity, discord soon broke out again. It was obvious that in Greece the departure of the Germans would prove to be a signal for civil war. Apparently, the United States was trying to get out of this unpleasant story somehow. But the Soviets had an influence on the Greeks, the British, anxious to establish their hegemony in the Eastern Mediterranean, made no secret of the fact that matters concerning Greece were within their sphere. The French government therefore never interfered in these matters, but it would have been better for the interests of Europe if France and England had acted together here, combining their forces and influence, as they had often done in the past. And Argyropoulos, the Greek representative to the committee, was quite convinced of this. This patriot and politician, who was uneasy about the threatening danger to his country, was convinced that by alienating France, Europe would run the risk of going down the wrong road, and he therefore bitterly regretted that the impenetrable veil between his government and that of the French Republic had come down under outside influence. In the same way our allies acted in regard to Yugoslavia. In that Serbo-Croatian Slovenian kingdom, even before the war, there had been violent strife between its various peoples, and now everything was turned upside down, everything was boiling. The Italians had formed a Croatian state there, and had cut into it Dalmatia and the Slovenian province of Ljubljanka. Colonel Mihajlovic waged a brave guerrilla war in the Serbian mountains. Later, Josip Broz Tito waged a war on behalf of the communists. The occupiers avenged their actions with unheard-of atrocities, massacres, ridiculous destruction, and meanwhile Mihajlovic and Tito became enemies of each other and turned into adversaries. In London, the very young King Peter II and his unstable government were not only powerless to cope with the gravest difficulties at home, but also came under the overbearing pressure of England. Indeed, the British looked to Yugoslavia as the main arena of their policy in the Mediterranean. Moreover, Winston Churchill regarded this policy as his bloody business. Cherishing plans for extensive operations in the Balkans, he intended to turn Yugoslavia into their bridgehead. From the very beginning of Mihailovich's actions, London helped him with weapons and advice, sent him a British mission. Later, the Prime Minister delegated his son Randolph to Tito. In the end, Tito was favoured, and the British government sent him equipment and uniforms for his troops. Mihailovic, on the other hand, was deprived of aid, was vilified in radio speeches from London, and a representative of the Foreign Office from the rostrum of the London House of Commons even accused him of treason. Not only that, in June 1944 Churchill demanded from the unhappy Peter II to dissolve the cabinet of Purik, in which Mihailovic was the Minister of War, and entrust the power to Sabasic, who had previously received his authority from Tito. Moscow, of course, approved of this course of action, and in Washington the Yugoslav ambassador, Fojic, could not get the United States to support his monarch. The French Committee of National Liberation was systematically kept out of the development of these events. I was only occasionally able to establish contact with General Mihailovich, who showed a keen desire to maintain relations with me. We exchanged messages with him. In February 1944, I awarded him the Military Cross and ordered the publication of a notice about it, wishing to encourage Mihailovich at a time when the ground was slipping from under his feet. But never once did the officers I tried to send to Mihailovich succeed in getting through to him. As for Tito, he never paid us the slightest sign of attention. With King Peter II and his ministers I maintained cordial relations during my stay in England. We exchanged diplomatic views and information through Maurice de Jean, our representative to the Yugoslav government, and Jovanovic, the Yugoslav representative to the French Committee. But never once did the Yugoslav government, probably lacking in discretion, ask us for any favour. As for England, she did not feel obliged to consult us even once, not even once. And I was determined to give to the cause of the liberation of France all the forces we could concentrate, without allowing them to take part in the Balkan operations. Why should we have interfered and offered military aid for a political enterprise from which we were excluded? If the advance of the Soviets and the activities of their agents caused some emigre governments excruciating fear, President Beans and his ministers emphasized that they did not fear in the slightest for Czechoslovakia. It is unlikely that deep down the Czechs were so calm, but they believed that it was pointless to fight against the inevitable, and that it was better to try to benefit themselves. By the way, their representative Cherny himself gave us this point of view. In December 1943, Beanies went to Moscow and signed a treaty of friendship, cooperation and mutual assistance with Stalin. On his way back to London, he stopped in Algiers on January 2nd. We received the Czechoslovak head of state in the most respectful manner, remembering that among the cruel vicissitudes in the fate of France, he always remained its friend. Beanies informed me of his negotiations in Moscow. He described Stalin as a man restrained in speech but firm in intentions, having in regard to each of the European problems his own thought, hidden but quite definite. Benesch then explained his policy to me. "Look at the map," he said. "The Russians are approaching the Carpathians. But in the west, the Allied forces are not yet ready to land in France. So it will be the Red Army that will liberate my country from the Germans. And in order for me to form our administration, I must enter into an agreement with Stalin." I did so, and even on such terms that do not affect the independence of Czechoslovakia. After all, on the basis of our agreement with him, the Russian command will not interfere in any way in our political affairs. Turning to the general situation of the country, the President began to prove to me, as he had done so many times before, that Czechoslovakia could be revived only through an alliance with Moscow. He drove his finger over the map and exclaimed, "Here is the Sudetenland, which we must take from the Germans. Here is Teschin, which the Poles are after. Here is Slovakia, which the Hungarians dream of taking back again. Their Monsignor Tiso has already set up his separate government. But tomorrow East Germany, Poland and Hungary will be in the hands of Soviet Russia. If she supports their claims, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia will inevitably follow. As you see, an alliance with the Russians is absolutely necessary for us." I tried to remind him of the possibility of turning to the west, but Beanies was very skeptical. "Roosevelt," he said, "wants to make a deal with Stalin and take his troops home as soon as possible after victory. Churchill cares very little about us. In his opinion, England's line of defense is on the Rhine and the Alps. Once he has achieved this, he will no longer care about anything but the Mediterranean. As far as we are concerned, he is prepared to equal Roosevelt's position, with some advantages in the east." As I know, at Tehran, by common consent, not a word was said about Czechoslovakia. True, there you are, General de Gaulle, the builder of a firm and strong France, essential to the European balance. If you had not appeared after the defeat, there would have been no more hope for the freedom of Europe. Therefore, no one wishes you so ardently for your complete success as I do. But one has to be convinced that Washington and London are not very conducive to it. What will happen tomorrow? Let it be remembered that the French Parliament gave Clemenceau his resignation as soon as the war was over. When the news of this came to Prague, I was sitting at work with the great Masaryk. And the same thought came to both of us: this is the self-denial of France. Beneš's opinion of the position of Washington and London with regard to Soviet aspirations had already been confirmed in the Polish question. The closer the Red Army came to Warsaw, the clearer Moscow's intention to exert its influence over Poland and to change its borders became apparent. It was already apparent that Stalin wanted on the one hand to annex the territories of Lithuania, Byelorussia and eastern Galicia, and on the other hand to settle the Poles up to the Oder and the Neisse at the expense of the Germans. But it was equally clear that the master of the Kremlin intended to establish a regime on the Vistula at his own discretion, and that the Anglo-Saxons were not going to veto it. THEPOLISH government in London was faced with heavy problems. It had no material means of resisting Moscow's decisions, but it was morally armed with the grim determination which centuries of oppression had communicated to Polish hearts. In truth, General Sikorski, chairman of the Council of Ministers and commander-in-chief, first tried to reach an agreement with the Soviets. At a time when the Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow, this agreement seemed possible. Large numbers of Polish soldiers taken prisoner by the Russians in 1939 had been allowed to go to the Middle East with their commander, General Anders, and Stalin had adopted a more moderate tone in negotiations about borders and future relations. Now the picture was very different, and so was the map of warfare. And the Poles were once again gripped by the resentment and fear that the Russians had instilled in them. In the spring of 1943, they officially, with some semblance of reason, accused them of having killed 10,000 Polish officers prisoners of war in the Katyn Forest 3 years earlier. Stalin broke off diplomatic relations with Poland in indignation. At this time, that is, in July 1943, General Sikorski, returning from Egypt, where he was inspecting Anders's troops, was killed in an air crash in Gibraltar. This distinguished man enjoyed prestige great enough to temper the passions of his countrymen and international fame great enough to be a force to be reckoned with. He was indispensable. Immediately after his death, the crisis in relations between Russia and Poland assumed the character of an acute conflict. However, the new Polish government, through its head, Mikołajczyk, promised that after the liberation the power in Warsaw would be established in such a composition as to guarantee Moscow good neighborly relations. As to the frontiers, he did not reject any project in advance, but only declared that this question could be settled only by the conclusion of a peace treaty. Mikołajczyk ordered the armed forces of the resistance to cooperate with the Soviet army. Finally, he appealed to the United States and England, wishing to end the controversy and come to a solution of all questions hanging in the air, but these peace-loving sentiments found no echo in the Kremlin. On the contrary, the discontent of the Russians grew stronger and stronger as they advanced. In January, on the occasion of the entry of their troops into Polish territory, the Soviets published a declaration according to which the so-called Curzon Line was to become the eastern frontier of Poland, and the composition of the London government was to be completely changed by the Poles. At the same time, a Polish army corps, the head of which, Berling, did not recognize the authority of the legitimate government, had been formed by the Russians and the Polish Committee of National Liberation, formed in Moscow and chaired by Ossipka Moravsky, came to Galicia after the Soviet troops. It was obvious that Anglo-Saxon support for Polish independence was very shaky. In January 1944, Cordell Hall gave an evasive answer to Mikołaj Jukszak's request for mediation. Roosevelt, who was to run again that year as a candidate for the presidency, was cautious on the Polish question, in accordance with the feelings of the Poles among his constituents. But it was foreseeable that, once the election was behind him, he would not want to tie Stalin's hands. The British proved less amenable, but it was very likely that since they equaled the Americans, they would eventually, in effect, concede, observing, however, some outward decorum. Indeed, Churchill and Eden, while uttering all sorts of good words in defense of Poland's independence, hurried Mikołajczyk's trip to Moscow. The visit took place on August 1st, just as the Soviet army approached Warsaw, and in the city the underground Polish army under the command of General Komorowski, called Burr, began operations against the Germans. After heroic fighting, the Poles were crushed and blamed the Russians for not giving them any help, and not even allowing British planes to use Soviet bases to make combat sorties from there to support the defenders of Poland. A few days before, the Polish ministers who had come to Moscow had heard from Stalin and Molotov not at all encouraging answers to their requests, and had been informed that an agreement had been concluded between the Soviet Union and the Polish Committee for National Liberation, which gave the committee the right to administer the liberated territories. Our government was unable to prevent this enslavement of Poland. Since we did not act in concert with our great allies in the field of diplomacy and did not participate on an equal footing in the formulation of strategic plans common to us all, how could we get the Western powers to take a certain political stand and make certain decisions which would surely save the independence of Poland and at the same time provide Russia with the frontier which she demanded? Personally, I found Stalin's idea of compensating Poland for the amputation to which her territory was being amputated in the east by her acquisition of the lands of Prussia and Silesia quite acceptable. I only wanted the inevitable transfer of population to be carried out with complete humanity. But I thought it necessary to thwart Stalin's intention to establish in Warsaw the dictatorship of his admirers. I thought that if America, England, and France, in the face of the whole world, had come together to certain conclusions, and if they had begun to act in concert in this direction, influencing the Soviet and Polish governments, and if they had further granted Western ships access to the ports of the Baltic Sea, and Russian ships to the ports of the North Sea, they would eventually have succeeded in restoring freedom to noble and courageous Poland. But in the face of the demands of Soviet Russia, America chose to remain silent. England sought a formula. France had no say in the matter. To the efficient and worthy ambassador of Poland to the French Committee of Liberation, Morawski, with whom I had many conversations, to General Sosnkowski, who took over after Sikorski's death as commander-in-chief, and whom I received in Algiers in December, to General Anders, whom I saw with his troops at Mount Cassino, to the President of the Polish Republic, Radzikiewicz, with whom I exchanged visits, while passing through London in June 1944, Foreign Minister Roma, whom I saw at the President's reception. I could only point out the position we were taking and assure him that we would make them all reckon with it if we had the opportunity. There was, however, a case in which we gave aid to the Polish government. We are talking about a considerable gold reserve which the State Bank of Poland entrusted to the French bank in September 1939, and the latter transferred it to Bamako in June 1940. In March 1944, the Liberation Committee, at the urgent request of the Mikołajczyk government, decided to return the Poles their gold. Bogomolov did not fail to address us with insistent statements about the necessity to postpone the transfer of the gold, and finally he asked me for admission and then told me. The Soviet government declares a strong protest against the transfer of the Polish gold reserve to the Polish emigrant government in London. For tomorrow it will no longer be the government of Poland. I replied that so far it was still a government, that it was recognized by all our allies, including Russia, that on its orders Polish troops were now fighting in Italy alongside our troops, and that, finally, I did not understand by what right the Soviet Union was interfering in matters concerning only Poland and France. Bogomolov left without concealing his displeasure. So, in spite of the advice of Washington, London, and Moscow to refrain from rapprochement with us, the middle and small states of Europe were eager to do so. Those who were separated from us by distance also wanted to be closer to us morally. General Vernier, the representative of Canada, brought us the greetings of his native land, which was an example to others in the war effort, and negotiated the economic aid which Canada was giving us, and the aid which it agreed to give in the future as France was liberated. Our allies, the countries of Latin America, have indicated through their plenipotentiaries that the return of France to her former international position vividly touches their feelings and is in their interests. Such statements were made, for example, in Brazil by Vasco da Cunha, in Peru by Aramburu, in Ecuador by Fraile Laria, in Cuba by Suarez Sola. Finally, a skillful, subtle diplomatist, Delegate de Sangranis of Spain, though he was the only representative of a neutral country among the delegates of the belligerent countries, and felt himself bound by a rather vague statute, was readily engaged in settling questions concerning Morocco, the fate of Tangier, the transportation of Frenchmen who had crossed the Pyrenees, and the commercial interchange between French Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. We did endeavour to establish the necessary relations with the Spaniards. They themselves desired it. I expected that in the near future there would be a resumption of diplomatic relations between Paris and Madrid under conditions worthy of two great neighbouring nations. But in Algiers our diplomatic activity was concentrated on relations with the three great Allied powers. Now I no longer had to conduct them myself in all cases, as in those days when we had, as a matter of fact, no ministries, but still I had to observe the general course of these affairs. I was therefore constantly meeting with representatives of the United States, Great Britain, and Soviet Russia. For if it was believed that their governments had not yet settled the question of who was really the head of France, they still sent their ambassadors to us, and they made no secret of the fact that they seriously expected to move with us to Paris in the not-too-distant future. After the reorganization of the Committee of Liberation, when I became its sole chairman, Washington and London heartily reconciled themselves to this fact and made the appropriate order. Robert Murphy, who bore the vague title of President Roosevelt's representative, was transferred to Italy. He was replaced by Edwin Wilson, who had the very definite title of representative of his government to our committee. Murphy's departure and the behavior of his successor caused, fortunately, a detente in our relations with the American embassy. Murphy had very little appreciation of the successes of the Gaullists, but Wilson seemed to enjoy them. As rare and strained were our conversations with Murphy, so frequent and pleasant were Wilson's visits. He was an eminent diplomatist and a man of heart. His loyalty prevented him from condemning a position, but it deeply distressed him. By his personal mediation, he more than once achieved that the point of view of one side was, if not accepted, at least understood by the other side, and on occasion he skillfully averted an outburst, whether from the Americans or from us. Duff Cooper did the same in our relations with the British. Until December 1943, the British representative in Algeria was Macmillan, who also performed other duties. He was now going to Italy as British Minister of State. At one time Churchill, sending him to Algeria, believed that, albeit with some restraint, he would still join the policy pursued in North Africa Americans. Macmillan realized, however, that this was not the best line. This man of lofty soul and bright mind had developed a sympathy with a group of Frenchmen who wanted to see France free from the fetters. I noticed how, as our relations developed, his prejudice against us dissipated. And I responded to him with a feeling of deep respect. Now that he was to leave, London decided to give him a worthy successor and at the same time normalize the position of England's representative. Duff Cooper was appointed ambassador to Algeria, with a subsequent transfer to Paris. This was one of the most gracious and sensible gestures made by His Majesty's government towards France. Duff Cooper was a man of uncommon talent. Whether it was politics, history, literature, art, science, he excelled in everything and was interested in everything. But in all his judgments he brought some restraint, probably explained by his modesty. This quality gave him a special charm, did not allow him to impose his opinions on others. However, he had firm convictions, unshakable principles. His entire life path testified to it. In years when events demanded that the best be nominated, he could have been Prime Minister in his homeland. It may be thought that one trait of nature, pinchiness, and one circumstance, the presence of Winston Churchill, prevented this. But if he did not become Prime Minister in London, he should have been the British ambassador in Paris. Like a true humanist, he loved France like a true diplomat. He discussed affairs with noble calm like a true Englishman. He served his king with integrity. As a mediator between Churchill and myself, he endeavoured to soften our clashes. Sometimes he succeeded. If it were possible for any mortal to always achieve this, surely only a man like Duff Cooper. On the Russian side we dealt, as before, with Bogomolov, who was eager to know everything, but would reveal his secrets to no one, and would suddenly become rigid when he formulated any categorical opinion of his government. Sometimes we met Wyszynski, who was temporarily engaged in Italian affairs, but was very knowledgeable in a wide variety of fields. He displayed a breadth of thought, and in addition, a trait seemingly surprising for a former Soviet prosecutor, a pleasant cheerfulness. However, at other times it suddenly became apparent how inexorable the orders binding him were. Once, when we were talking not far from the others, so that we could be heard, I said to him it was a great mistake on our part that we did not act in open alliance with you against Hitler before 1939. But how much you yourselves are to blame for making a treaty with him and letting him crush us. Wyszynski straightened up, turned pale. He made a gesture as if he were dismissing some mysterious threat. No, no, he muttered. Never, never, never should this be said. In general, relations between France and its allies were developing contrary to the rule of extreme caution specified in the Code of Diplomacy. On January 1st, 1944, a very revealing spectacle took place. On that day, the diplomatic corps came with great pomp to the Villa Olivia to congratulate me and to bring me New Year's wishes, as is customary for a head of government. In the reception room there was even a heated argument between the Russian and English ambassadors which of them is the elder of the diplomatic corps, and should therefore read out the traditional address. Duff Cooper got the upper hand. But this solemn visit and this rivalry were a sign of our ascendancy. Yet the intentions of the Allied leaders toward France kept diplomats in a state of chronic tension. Roosevelt stubbornly denied our committee the right to be the French state power during the period of liberation. England allowed her diplomats to say that she considered this American position too strict, but nevertheless tolerated it. If it had been a matter of terminology here, it would not have bothered us in the least. But behind this refusal to recognize us as a French national power, there was in reality a persistent desire on the part of the President of the United States to establish his arbitration in France. I felt that I could practically render utterly fruitless his attempts to encroach upon our independence. On a suitable occasion, Roosevelt might have been convinced of this. But the delays caused by his obstinacy prevented the military commanders from knowing in advance with whom they must deal in their dealings with the French. And in addition, until the last minute between us and our allies, there were escalations and all sorts of trouble, which could well have been avoided. After all, the Liberation Committee in September 1943 sent a memorandum to Washington and London, precisely defining the conditions under which the cooperation of the French authorities with the Allied armed forces was to take place during the battle for France. It stated that in the combat zone, the military command should contact the local authorities, and they are obliged to provide it with means of communication, radio, all kinds of communications and services. In the rear, the French government will take all measures to fulfill the requirements of General Eisenhower. To ensure contact with the armed forces, it was provided that French administrative liaison officers would go with each military unit, that a general with certain powers and the necessary personnel would be seconded to assist Eisenhower. That before the government arrived in the metropolis, a member of the government would be sent there to make the necessary arrangements. And in fact, the Administrative Liaison Corps had already been formed in September 1943, placed under the command of Attier de Boilhambert, manned, trained and transported to England. In March 1944, I appointed General Koenig and General Cochet as assistant commanders-in-chief of the Allied forces, one in the Northern Theatre and the other in the Mediterranean. On the same day, André Letroca was appointed National Commissioner for the Liberated Territory. The measures we had planned met with the approval of the Allied headquarters. For their implementation only lacked the consent of the Washington and London governments, and they kept failing to respond to our memorandum. The President kept this document on his desk month after month. Meanwhile, in the United States, some kind of Allied military government was being prepared to take over the administration of France. All sorts of theorists, technicians, businessmen, propagandists, yesterday's Frenchmen, turned by their new nationality into Americans, swarmed into this organization. Neither the statements which Monnet and Opinieu felt obliged to make in Washington, nor the remarks which the British government sent to the United States, nor the insistent requests Eisenhower made to the White House, stirred any water. But since it was necessary to come to some conclusion, Roosevelt ventured at last to give Eisenhower instructions by virtue of which the supreme authority in France was to be vested in the commander-in-chief. On the basis of his rights, he was to choose the French authority at his own discretion, and she was to cooperate with him. We soon learned that Eisenhower begged the president not to give him this political responsibility, and that the British disapproved of such an arbitrary system. But Roosevelt, while tweaking his instruction in minor details, left its essence intact. In truth, the president's intentions reminded me of Alice in Wonderland. In North Africa, in an environment much more favorable to Roosevelt's intentions, he had already tried to carry out the policy that he intended to implement in France. His attempt failed. My government enjoyed independent power in Corsica, in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. Black Africa, the men Washington had counted on to prevent it, were gone. No one remembered the Darlan-Clark Agreement anymore. The National Committee recognized it as null and void, and I declared in public from the rostrum of the Consultative Assembly that in the eyes of France it did not exist. But the failure of Roosevelt's policy in Africa still did not dispel his illusions, which I regretted, both from the point of view of his interests and from the point of view of our relations. But I was sure that the application of his project in the metropolis was out of the question. The Allies would find no other ministers or other officials in France than those I had appointed, nor would they have found any other French troops than those which recognize me as their head. Without any doubt, I could say to General Eisenhower, your agreement will be valid only with those people whom I specify. In fact, Eisenhower himself thought so. He stated this on December 30th when he came to me before his trip to Washington, from where he was to fly to London to make preparations for the landing of Allied troops in France. I have been unfavorably disposed toward you, he said. I now recognize my opinion as erroneous. In the coming battle I shall need not only the aid of your armed forces, but also the assistance of your officials and the moral support of the people of France. In short, I need your help. I have come to ask you for it in good time, I replied. You are a real man, for you are capable of saying I was wrong. We spoke of the uncertainty in which the question of the necessary cooperation in France between our authorities and the military command still lingered. Eisenhower did not conceal from me that it troubled him greatly. But beyond principles, he said, there are real facts. I can assure you that, whatever position may be imposed on me for external decorum, in reality I shall recognize in France, as the French authority, only you. I then pointed out that we would probably have occasion to show our unity in deciding how Paris should be liberated. It is the French troops who must recapture the capital of France, I remarked, and for this purpose it is only necessary to transfer one French division to England in time, which is what we French have asked you to do, Eisenhower agreed. With the approaching deadline for the landing, scheduled headquarters, the British showed a desire to bring the political problem out of the impasse in which it found itself. Churchill decided to assume the role of a broker, intending to harmonize the claims of Roosevelt and the protests of General de Gaulle. But since the Americans had an overwhelming preponderance of power and means of publicity, the Prime Minister's efforts were soon reduced to forcing me to accede to Roosevelt's demands. Early in January, Duff Cooper appeared to me and said, "You know that Churchill fell ill while returning from Tehran. He has been transferred to Marrakesh. He would very much like to see you, but for health reasons he cannot move anywhere. Will you not consent to visit him?" It would have been natural for the English Prime Minister, while on French territory, to pay a visit to the head of the French government. However, out of respect for Churchill's person and considering the circumstances, I went to see him and on January 12th was at his breakfast. He was almost recovered. We had a long talk with him for the first time in 6 months. Duff Cooper, Lord Beaverbrooks, Lord Gaston Paluski were present. The Prime Minister spoke animatedly and heatedly, assiduously describing the benefits to me of my acquiescence to the President's intention. In general, it came down to the fact that I must recognize Roosevelt's primacy in French affairs on the pretext that he has publicly taken a certain position, and therefore cannot abandon it, and, in addition, has made certain commitments in respect of certain French dignitaries compromised by cooperation with Vichy, and must fulfill these obligations. Turning to concrete facts, Churchill advised me to suspend preparations for the trial of Flandin, Pyroton and Boyson. "I have familiarized myself with the materials in the Flandin case," Churchill told me. "There is nothing serious against him. And since he is in North Africa, it proves that he is broken with Vichy. As for Pyroton, he came to Algeria to take up the post of governor at the invitation of the President of the United States. Boyson was once guaranteed by the President that he would keep his place, and I told him to say, 'Fight a good fight and don't worry about the rest.' Churchill called unfortunate the fact that Generals Giraud and Georges had to withdraw from the French government. For the former, he said, was chosen by Roosevelt himself. The other was invited here by me. To listen to Churchill, it would have been immediately clear that the President of the United States and the British Prime Minister consider France their fiefdom, where they can dispose of as they please, and General de Gaulle, they are dissatisfied mainly because he does not want to put up with it. I very kindly replied to Churchill that the interest in our internal affairs, which is shown by Churchill and Roosevelt, is in my eyes proof of the beginning of the revival of France. And therefore, not wishing to disappoint them, I do not wish to allow revolutionary unrest in my country, and unrest will occur inevitably if justice is not done. I wish no harm to either Flandin or Pyroton. As for Flandin, I did not deny his valuable qualities and good intentions. Nor did I forget that Pyroton had done a service to the unification of our forces by placing his radio station at my disposal when I arrived in Algiers. But I believe that for the sake of the interests of the nation they must both answer, in the Supreme Court, for their actions as Vichy ministers. The appointment of Boyson as Governor-General depended solely on his superiors. Whether or not Generals Giraud and Georges are part of my government is my business. I will continue to follow the path I have followed so far, the path of independence, because I am convinced that it is best not only for the state and the nation for which I am responsible, but also for our allies with whom I am allied. In order to diffuse the atmosphere, I invited Churchill to review the garrison with me the next day. He readily agreed. The review ceremony took place and delighted the people of Marrakech. For the crowd of curious people gathered here, and for any spectators in any other place, for all the people who would have seen this picture before them without knowing anything about its underside, the fact that Churchill and de Gaulle appeared together and stand side by side, it means that soon the Allied armies will move together to achieve victory, and that is the most important thing. I said this to the Prime Minister, and he and I concluded that, after all, the crowd of onlookers was quite right here. But in order to influence me, the English have on other occasions resorted to methods of a very different kind. In the winter, some English authorities, in apparent agreement with the relevant American services, concocted a dirty business aimed at defaming me. It began with a noisy press campaign in the United States, trying to assure the public that the former organization fighting France and its head were trying to establish their dictatorship in France, and had already allowed themselves actions worthy of totalitarian power. The newspapers published a made-up text from beginning to end of some wild oath allegedly taken by volunteers joining the armed forces of Free France. Our services, especially the BSRA, were accused, it was alleged, that we were enforcing the rules of our harsh discipline by ill treatment and even torture. After such preparations, the Dufour affair suddenly arose. Under the name of Dufour, a certain intelligence service agent, secretly recruited from us in France, was taken by the British to Great Britain in 1942, and, appearing in the organization fighting France, declared his desire to volunteer for its troops. He posed as a lieutenant and a knight of the Legion of Honor. His superiors soon realized that he was neither, but simply a member of British intelligence. Dufour was sentenced to imprisonment for unlawfully assuming military rank and title and signed a new pledge, already as a private, which he was in reality. But while serving his sentence in the Camberley camp, he escaped one day with the help of the intelligence service and joined his employers. From the French point of view, he was a deserter and a miscreant used by the Foreign Intelligence Service, which patronized him. Since it was not possible for us to arrest him on English territory, the French command in England did not think about him for more than a year, when suddenly in September 1943 Pierre Viennet was summoned to the Foreign Office and made him the following surprising message. Dufour has lodged a complaint in an English court against the ill treatment of which he accuses certain French officers and General de Gaulle himself. By virtue of the principle of the complete independence of the judiciary, the British government cannot interfere with the lawful progress of the trial. Moreover, General de Gaulle does not enjoy the right of diplomatic immunity in my country. Perhaps he would like to suspend the case by amicable agreement with Dufour. Otherwise, he will be brought to trial. We feel obliged to advise General de Gaulle to pay serious attention to this case, for a possible conviction will be to the press, especially in the United States, a pretext for an extremely unpleasant campaign on the methods and techniques of influencing subordinates in the troops of fighting France, and indeed, at this very moment malignant hints were already appearing in some of the American newspapers, which had made it their specialty to attack us. I could tell unmistakably where these invectives of rather low character were coming from and what they were caused by. Dufour, the English agent and French deserter, had undoubtedly instituted proceedings against me in the English courts only at the instigation of his masters. As for the London government, if it disregards the agreements with Free France, by virtue of which French soldiers in Britain are subject only to the trial of French military tribunals, if the London government does not recognize for de Gaulle the right of diplomatic immunity enjoyed in England by the last of all the secretaries of 50 foreign embassies, if it tries to frighten de Gaulle with the prospect of scandal and slander, then all these machinations are politically motivated and invented. Public opinion insisted that they should soon adopt a position worthy of alliance with de Gaulle, with his government, and with France, and the White House and Downing Street flattered themselves with the hope that they could reply, "We must abstain until this ugly story is brought to light." I resolved not to be ceremonious. Since some officers on duty in England had succumbed to the intimidation of the Foreign Office and had entrusted the defence of the case to English lawyers, I ordered that the defenders be immediately abandoned. I prohibited my subordinates from responding to any questions, subpoenas or summonses from the English judiciary. I instructed Viennet to notify the front office that I saw the purpose of such a machination, that I understood that I was being attempted to be dirtied in order to justify a political mistake made by the Allies, that I regarded the tactic as it deserved. That is to say, I regarded it as despicable, and that the consequences of these secrets of the New York or Washington court would fall, of course, not on me, but on those who had concocted them. 4 months have passed since then. London made itself known only by occasional reminders, to which we made no reply. But in March the conspiracy was put into action again. It must be said that the ordinance restoring state power in France was passed on March 21st. All over the world, the newspapers picked up the sensation and declared it was the purest truth that General de Gaulle and his committee considered themselves the government of France and were going to establish themselves there without asking the consent of the Allies. Roosevelt, who was zealously pestered by the reporters, told them with irritation no one, not even the French National Liberation Committee itself, can know what the French people really think. Consequently, for the United States, the question remains unresolved. A week after the ordinance was signed, however, the final attack on us in the Dufour case occurred. On March 28th, Duff Cooper, evidently hesitating to speak to me personally on this matter, which, however, was considered as pertaining to me, requested an appointment with Massigli. He instructed Massigli to convey to me that the English court could wait no longer. The British government was compelled to give it a free hand, and the trial was about to commence. But it turned out that we could make a worthy reply to this message. At the beginning of 1943, Stéphane Magnier, a supporter of Free France, who had been seconded to the British Broadcasting Service in Accra to carry French broadcasts, and who had been doing excellent work there, returned to England at our call. In consequence of some mistake or confessed calculation, the intelligence service arrested him as soon as he arrived and confined him to the premises of the Patriotic School for interrogation. But there, whether from nervous shock or in a violent delirious fit of tropical malaria, the unfortunate man committed suicide. And then, as if by chance, I suddenly received a letter from his son, who served in the Navy in North Africa. The young sailor asked me to inquire into the more than suspicious circumstances of his father's death. He informed me of his intention to file a complaint in a French court against intelligence service officers on French soil and against members of the British government, including Winston Churchill, as soon as they were in France. I instructed Massigli to inform the English embassy of the text of our plaintiff's letter and to convey from me personally that the French government has no way of preventing the court from doing its business. And unfortunately, it is to be feared that all over the world the newspapers will run a very unpleasant campaign about the methods and techniques of interrogation in the intelligence service, which the English government is covering up. I don't know why, but the English court dismissed the case, and the London cabinet, despite the principle of separation of powers, somehow managed to stop the process from starting. However, that is not my concern. I have never heard of the Dufour case since. A cold shower was followed by a warm shower. On April 14th and 17, Duff Cooper came to see me to deliver a message from the Prime Minister. Churchill, according to the ambassador, was extremely distressed at the bad state of my relations with Roosevelt. But he was convinced that if I talked to the President as man to man, these relations would improve. In particular, the question of recognizing the Liberation Committee would surely be resolved. Churchill was stating that he was prepared to transmit immediately to Roosevelt a request for my going to Washington and guarantee me a favorable reply. I stated to Duff Cooper that this invitation, as well as previous invitations, had little appeal to me. If the President of the United States really wishes to receive the head of the French government, it would cost him nothing to ask de Gaulle to visit him. In that case, I shall certainly undertake a trip to the United States. But why should I ask, even through Churchill, that the President should consent to my visit? How would he interpret my request? After all, Roosevelt openly declares that only he can wield power in France. But I have nothing to ask of him. Formal recognition no longer interests the French government. It only wants to be recognized by the French nation. And that has already been achieved. The Allies could have helped us in due course by recognizing us. They did not. And now it makes no difference to us. As to the relations between the French authorities and the military command, I said to the ambassador, "The matter will be settled very easily. as long as the command does not usurp anything here. Otherwise there will be chaos in France. And this chaos will be disastrous for military operations and for the policy of the Allies. I concluded by saying that of course it would be possible for me to go to Washington some day, but only when events themselves had settled our dispute, when the first liberated piece of French soil had been liberated, when the authority of my government had been established. When the Americans had proved that in France they wished to interfere in nothing else but military operations, and when the principle that France was one and indivisible had been accepted in the strongest possible terms. In the meantime, I can only express the wish that all this may be accomplished as soon as possible, and hope that circumstances will then enable me to go to the United States with peace of mind. At any rate, I am grateful to Churchill for making arrangements for my going, and I thank him in advance for whatever he may wish to do in that direction. As I had endeavoured to leave the Allied advances unaffected, I should, by the law of the swing of the pendulum, now expect unpleasant measures of action. Indeed, on April 21st, we received notice that the transmission of cipher telegrams which we had exchanged with our diplomatic and military missions would not henceforth be made. This was ostensibly on account of the need to keep the preparations for the landing in the deepest secrecy. But we could not but regard as an insult such a one-sided precaution, taken by the English only against the French, whose armed forces, as well as those of the English, were soon to play an important part in military operations, and whose territory was to be the scene of battle. And then the Committee of Liberation forbade its ambassador Vianot and its military delegate Koenig to settle any question with the Allies so long as the English believed that they knew without us what orders we were giving and what reports were being sent to us. Such absenteeism made it very difficult for Eisenhower and his staff, and tensions in diplomatic relations increased. Of course, our coded messages continued to arrive at their destination, thanks to French officers and officials flying between London and Algiers. The crisis had reached its highest point, and meanwhile the deadline for landing was approaching. The Allies could not delay any longer. They had to find a way out. So I was not surprised when, on May 23rd, Duff Cooper asked that I receive him immediately. From that day, as we in theory could no longer communicate by code with London, I had to refuse, to my great regret, to receive the English ambassador. This time my door was opened to him, as he wanted to notify me of the new orientation. He told me that the English government was inviting me to London to settle the question of our recognition and the question of our administrative cooperation in France. The ambassador also stated that it was desirable to his government that I should be in England at the time of the landing. I replied to Duff Cooper that I was very much touched by this attention. Indeed, I was very anxious to be at the place of embarkation at the moment when the armies of liberation rushed into action, and expected that as soon as the first lands in our metropolis were liberated, I would enter them. So I decided to go to London. But as to the political arrangement, I had to be extremely cautious. I repeated to the ambassador my former answer. I said that I was not at all interested in being recognized as our allies. And by the way, I told him that we would immediately change the name of the Liberation Committee into the Government of the French Republic, whatever the opinion of the Allies might be on the subject. As to the terms of our cooperation with the military command, we have long ago defined them in that memorandum to which we have not been answered. Now the British government may be disposed to subscribe to our terms, but the American government is not disposed to do so. Why, then, should the French and English discuss measures which cannot be applied because of Roosevelt's opposition? We are, of course, ready to negotiate practical forms of cooperation, but it is necessary that not 2 but 3 parties be involved in the discussion. In conclusion, I warned Duff Cooper that I was going to London only on the condition that I would be guaranteed the ability to communicate in code with my government. On May 26, the Liberation Committee expressed its agreement with the position which I had outlined to the English ambassador. It was decided that none of the ministers would accompany me. It had to be made clear what the purpose of my trip was. I was not going to negotiate at all. I wanted to be present at the start of the landing operations, and, if possible, to visit the French population in the combat zone. The committee then unanimously approved the ordinance, by virtue of which it became already and formally the provisional government of the French Republic. The next day I received Duff Cooper again and confirmed to him my answer of yesterday. He gave me proper written assurance as to the use of the cipher. Roosevelt now considered it a good thing to try to straighten things out, but fearing lest this evolution might make a noise, he took a rather roundabout way of informing me of it. He chose as messenger Admiral Fenard, who headed our naval mission to the United States and who was on good terms personally with the Master of the White House. The Admiral arrived from the United States on May 27th. Appearing before me, he reported as follows: "The President has persistently requested me to convey to you his invitation to come to Washington. In view of the position he has hitherto taken in this matter, he cannot now proceed in an official way without prejudice to his prestige, and has therefore resorted to a semi-official invitation. If you also unofficially accept the invitation, the usual embassy authorities will arrange everything for your trip and make it so that it will not be necessary to publicize on whose initiative, yours or Roosevelt's." It took place, however strange the procedure to which the President had resorted. I could not disregard his desire to meet me, expressed so definitely, nor could I disregard the importance which our visit would undoubtedly have. So I recognized that it would soon be necessary for me to go to Washington, but an outpouring of feeling and thought would be inappropriate. I instructed Admiral Fenard to reply in such a way as to delay the time, to say that the invitation had been extended and was gratefully received, but to point out that no firm plans could be made now, as I was leaving for London, and to conclude by saying that talk of the trip should be resumed at a later date. The President's démarche finally enlightened me. It became clear to me that my long struggle with the Allies for French independence was coming to a desirable denouement. Of course, some final obstacle will still have to be overcome, but the outcome of the struggle is no longer in doubt. June 2nd comes a message from Churchill. He urgently summons me to England, kindly puts at my disposal his personal airplane. The next day I leave. With me went Palevsky, Bitois, Biotet, Geffroy, de Courcelles, Taiso. Landing at Casablanca, a second at Gibraltar. On the morning of June 4th we are in England, near London, and at once we were seized by a torrent of events. Immediately upon arrival I was handed a letter from Churchill. He invited me to come to him on the train, in which he was waiting for the day, and the number settled somewhere near Portsmouth. Pierre Vienot and I went there. The Prime Minister received us. He had with him ministers, notably Eden and Bevin, generals, and among them Miss May. Marshal Smuts was also there, apparently feeling rather uncomfortable. In fact, a few months before he had said that, since France was no longer a great power, there was nothing left for her to do but to join the British Commonwealth of Nations. The Anglo-Saxon press had widely publicized his words. Everyone was invited to breakfast, and as soon as they sat down at the table, Churchill threw himself into the fray. First of all, he described in strikingly vivid terms the broad operation that would soon unfold, starting from the shores of England, and he stated with satisfaction that the initial stage of it would be carried out mainly by English means. In particular, he said, "The English Navy will have to play a vital part in the transfer of troops and the protection of transport ships." I expressed to the Prime Minister quite sincerely my admiration for such achievements. After many and many trials, which England has borne with extraordinary courage, thus saving Europe, she is now the base of attack on the continent and throws into battle such a large force. This is an irrefutable proof of the correctness of the courageous policy, the embodiment of which has been Churchill since the darkest days of England. And though the events soon to come will cost France dearly, she is nevertheless proud to be in the fighting ranks and to stand side by side with the Allies to fight for the liberation of Europe. At this historic moment, a spirit of respect and friendship united all the French and British gathered there. And then we got down to business. "Let's work out an agreement on our cooperation with you in France," Churchill told me. "And then you will take it to America and give it to the President for consideration. It is possible that he will agree to it, and then you can apply it. In any case, you will talk to Roosevelt." He will relent and recognize your administration in one form or another, I replied. Why do you think I am obliged to ask Roosevelt to approve my candidacy in order to gain power in France? The French government exists. I have nothing to ask in this respect either from the United States or from England. It is a settled matter, and it is very important for all the Allies to establish a system of relations between the French administration and the military command. 9 months ago, we proposed a certain system. Since the landing of the Allied armies is imminent, I understand that you are in a hurry to settle this matter. We want it ourselves. But this settlement requires an American representative. Where is he? He's not here. And without him, you see, we can't settle anything at the moment. It should be noted, however, that the Washington and London governments seem inclined to do without an agreement with us. I have, for instance, just learned that, contrary to my warnings, the Allied troops and services preparing for the landing are carrying with them allegedly French money made abroad, money which the government of the French Republic can in no way recognize, whereas, by order of the Allied command, that this money is to have compulsory circulation in French territory. I am already expecting that tomorrow General Eisenhower, under the instructions of the President of the United States and in agreement with you, will announce that he is taking France under his authority. How do you expect us to negotiate with you on such a basis? And you, Churchill exclaimed, you seem to want us Englishmen to take a position different from that of the United States. Then, with a fervent passion, intended no doubt more for his listeners than for me, Churchill continued, we shall soon liberate Europe, but we can do so only because the Americans are fighting beside us. Remember, whenever we have to choose between Europe and the sea, we will always choose the sea. Whenever I have to choose between you and Roosevelt, I'll always choose Roosevelt. Eden shook his head. Apparently he wasn't very convinced by this lunge. And Labour Bevin, the Minister of Labour, came to me and said quite loudly, so that everyone could hear him, the Prime Minister has told you that in all cases he will always take the side of the President of the United States. Know that he was speaking for himself, and by no means for the English cabinet. Churchill and I then drove to General Eisenhower's headquarters. It was located nearby, in a dense forest. In the barracks, where the walls hung with maps, the Commander-in-Chief with great clarity and composure outlined to us the plan of landing and reported on the preparations for it. Ships are able to leave the ports at any minute. Airplanes can take to the air at the first signal. Troops have been loaded on ships for days. A huge machine, the sailing, crossing, landing of the first echelon, that is, 8 divisions and war materials is set up. Everything is thought out to the smallest detail. Support of the operation by warships, aviation, parachute landing, nothing is left to chance. I was convinced that in the preparation of this risky and very complex case in full measure showed the ability of the British to what they call planning. But the Commander-in-Chief had still to fix the day and hour, and here he was very uneasy. Indeed, everything is calculated so that the landing will take place between the 3rd and 7th of June. After that date, the tidal conditions and the phases of the moon would change, and the operation would have to be postponed for about a month. The weather, however, is very bad. It is dangerous to sail on the sea and approach to the shore for shalloons, pontoons and dinghies at such a wave, and it is necessary no later than tomorrow to give an order to start or postpone the operation. Eisenhower asked me, what do you think about it? I replied to the Commander-in-Chief that he alone can decide, because the responsibility lies with him, that my opinion does not oblige him to anything, and I unconditionally approve in advance everything that he decides. I will only tell you, I added, that if I were you I would not delay. A fall in atmospheric pressure is less unpleasant than delaying the landing for a few weeks. It will increase the moral tension of the participants in the operation, and secrecy may be broken. When I was about to leave, Eisenhower, in obvious embarrassment, handed me some document. Printed on a typewriter here, he said, a proclamation that I am going to issue an appeal to the peoples of Europe, and, in particular, to the French people. I ran over the text of the proclamation and told Eisenhower that it did not satisfy me. It is only a draft, assured me the Commander-in-Chief. I am ready to change it according to your comments. It was agreed that tomorrow I would inform him specifically what changes I considered necessary here. Churchill took me to his train, where I was to meet my own. I did not conceal my anxiety from him. Although the bright prospect of battle was before us, the black shadow of insidious politics already lay upon it. Indeed, the proclamation drafted for Eisenhower in Washington was unacceptable. In it, the Commander-in-Chief first addressed the peoples of Norway, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and spoke as a soldier entrusted with a specific military task and who had nothing to do with the political fate of the nations. Then he addressed the French nation and spoke in a very different tone. He invited it to obey all his orders. He had already decided that all must remain in place and perform their duties until further notice. And that, as soon as France was liberated, the French would choose their own representatives and their own government. In short, he pretended that he was responsible for our country, whereas for her he was merely a general of the Allied army, a skillful military commander, but not entitled to govern her, and he would have been in an extremely difficult position if he had actually had to do so. Not a word was said in his pamphlet about that French power which for some years now had inspired our people and directed their war effort. It had honored Eisenhower by placing a large part of the French army under his command. On the morning of June 5th, I sent the text of the proclamation in a version acceptable to us, just in case. As I expected, I was told that it was too late. The proclamation had already been printed, and was about to be dispersed from airplanes over French territory. Indeed, the landing was to begin the following night. In London, as before, I placed my bureau at Carlton Gardens, and myself lodged at the Connaught Hotel. It was with great pleasure that I met Charles Peake, whom the Foreign Office had seconded to us for liaison. This diplomat, who had become a friend of mine, came to me on June 5th to inform me of the program of a radio program to be held the next day morning. First, according to the schedule, the heads of state of Western Europe would address their peoples the Norwegian king, the Dutch queen, the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, and the Prime Minister of Belgium. Then Eisenhower will read his proclamation. I will conclude with a proclamation to France. I have told Charles Peake that this performance will take place without my participation. If I make a speech after the Commander-in-Chief, it may seem that I approve of his proclamation. While I fundamentally disagree with it, in addition, I will take a place here, not at all appropriate for me. If I speak on the radio, it will be only separately, at another hour, and not at the tail end of the line of speakers. At 2:00 in the morning, Vienneau came to see me. He had just returned from Churchill, who had called him to yell at him, pouring out his anger against me. Following Vienneau came Peake. I told him that the oratorical conveyor belt which will be launched this morning will do without me. But I want to be able to appear on the BBC tonight. After some secret clashes behind the scenes, London radio was indeed placed at my disposal on the terms I set out. I spoke separately at 6:00 in the evening, and with deep excitement said to the French a decisive battle has begun. The battle in France will certainly be a battle for France. For the sons of France, wherever they are and whoever they are, it is a simple and sacred duty to smash the enemy with every means at their disposal. Execute exactly the orders of the French government and the leaders it has authorized to give orders. From behind the clouds swollen with our blood and tears, the sun of our greatness has already peeped out. I spent several days in England. The news of the fighting was good. The landing had been a success. Around Bayeux there was now a pre-bridge fortification. Artificial ports were set up off the coast, as had been foreseen. The operation involves the French armed forces ships, squadrons of airplanes, special detachments, parachutists, and with respect to all of them received excellent reports from Arjan-Liu-Wallen, Le Gentilhomme. Leclerc and his division are waiting in good order, though impatiently, for the moment when they can land in Normandy. Our services, especially the intendants, which since the now distant days of Free France, has been under the direction of Intendant Mengy, have had their hands full. The Intendant's office is busy supplying our troops. There have never been so many French contingents in England. All manner of aid to the liberated territories is also being prepared. Lastly, Koenig reports to me on the action of our internal forces, which, either at his direction or of their own accord, have engaged the enemy in many districts. They are keeping several large German units behind the front at bay. In addition, the destruction contemplated by our plans is being carried out everywhere. It is true that the Germans for the first time used against London their Feuerei, but no matter how heavy these bombardments, they can no longer change the course of the battle. However, while strategically the horizon seems bright, the skies of diplomacy are only slowly clearing of clouds. Eden tries to disperse them. He has taken it upon himself personally, probably in consultation with the British cabinet, to negotiate the cooperation in France that Churchill has hitherto led. On June 8th, Eden, in the company of Duff Cooper and Pierre Vienneau, came to dine and talk with me. He insisted that the French government should recant, send Massagli to London, and sign the Franco-English agreement. If you and I agree, Eden told me, the Americans cannot remain on any separatist position. When you go to Washington, I'll go there too, and Roosevelt will have to sign off on whatever you and I accept. Eden backed up his offer with a letter, addressing it to Vienneau. But we French held firm. I answered the English again and again that I had not come to London to negotiate. The Algerian government, whose opinion I asked for, agrees with me. So Massagli stays where he is. Vienneau replies to Eden that if the English cabinet wishes to enter into negotiations concerning our Memorandum 1943, he, Vienneau, in his capacity as ambassador, can receive and transmit the necessary communications. At the same time, we did not miss an opportunity to emphasize the absurdity of the position in which the Allied armies would find themselves without organized communication with the French authorities and French officials, and we declared in public that we did not recognize the money printed abroad which the Allies were going to distribute in France. On June 10th, I gave a short interview to a news agency in which I clarified my view of the situation. Furthermore, I decided that our administrative liaison officers, with the exception of a few informers, would not accompany the American and British headquarters, for we had no intention of assisting the usurpation. It goes without saying that a howl went up in the hostile part of the American press. But another part of it and most of the English newspapers censured Roosevelt's obstinacy. At that moment, those people who had always supported us in the press and on the radio with the power of their talent unanimously and energetically came forward. In the United States, Walter Lippmann, Edgar Moore, Dorothy Thompson, Jeff Parsons, Eric Hawkins, Helen Kirkpatrick, Mac Wayne, Charles Collingwood, Sonia Tamara, and others stood up in our defence in England, Harold Nicholson, Harold King, Bourdain, Glarner, D'Arcy Seeley, and many others. All of them declared that it was time to quit joking. The same opinion was held by the governments that had found refuge in England. Liberation seemed no longer distant, and they were now discarding the psychology of the exiles. All were alarmed at the cavalier manner in which the great powers sought to dominate their countries and decide the fate of Europe in the absence of the governments concerned. I had occasion to converse with the King of Norway, with the Queen of Holland, with the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg and their ministers, to dine with Pierlot Spaak, Goucht and their colleagues in the Belgian government, to exchange visits with Presidents Benesch and Raxkiewicz. And I saw that they were all satisfied with the refusal of France to submit to the intentions of the Anglo-Saxons to appropriate the rights of others. Between June 8th and June 20th, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Yugoslavia, and Norway formally recognized the provisional government of the French Republic, in spite of the insistent demarches of America and England to refrain from recognition. Only Holland took a wait-and-see attitude, believing that by yielding to Washington's wishes in this matter, she would receive from him a more generous compensation in Indonesia. The almost complete unanimity shown toward us by the European states undoubtedly impressed America and England, but the gloom of doubt was finally dispelled by the sentiments of the French, manifested on the little piece of French soil just liberated in the fighting. Indeed, on June 13th, I went there, wishing to visit the pre-bridge fortification. I had been ready to leave for several days, but the Allies were in no hurry to give me this opportunity. Even the day before, when I had been at a dinner at the Foreign Office surrounded by English ministers, and when I was congratulated that I was about to enter the land of my fatherland, Eden had been handed a letter from Churchill at the table, in which he again objected to my going. But after consulting with his colleagues seated around him, and particularly with Clement Attlee, Eden informed me that the whole cabinet had decided to confirm the orders made by the British side. So the glorious counter-battleship combatant, commanded by Captain Patou, 3rd rank, who had already distinguished himself in the landing operations, approaches Portsmouth, as provided, and takes me on board. I take with me Vivok, D. Agentliu Betoir, Pelevsky, Beate Kulevsur, Kulate, Chevignier, Korsel, Boiselembert, and Teso. On the morning of June 14th, we anchor as near the French shore as possible, and finally may make land on the boundary between the communes of Courcelles and Saint. Mere Église, passing among the soldiers of the Canadian regiment which was landing at that moment. General Montgomery, commander of the Allied forces in the pre-bridge fortification, had been warned an hour in advance of our landing, and had kindly placed automobiles and guides at our disposal. Major Chandon, the French liaison officer, immediately appeared with his detachment. I immediately sent 2 persons to Bayeux X, François Coulet, whom I immediately appointed commissary of the Republic in the liberated Norman territory, and Colonel de Chevignet, placing him in charge of this district of the military district. I then proceeded to the main apartment. Montgomery received me in the van, where he is working under a portrait of Rommel, whom he defeated at El Alamein, but for whom he has great respect. Montgomery, a major British figure, combines caution and austerity with fiery energy and a sense of humour. His operations are going on their way according to plan. In the southern direction has already reached the first object. Now it is necessary that the Americans in the west to seize Cherbourg, and in the east took Caen. This requires, General Montgomery told me, to put in place new military units and throw here more combat equipment. Listening to him, I was convinced that under his command the offensive would be conducted thoroughly, but not hastily and without much courage. Having expressed my confidence in the general, I bowed out, not wishing to disturb him, and went to Bayeux. Coulet had already begun his duties there. For Bordeaux de Fontenay, Commissioner of the Republic in Normandy, could not get out of Rouen and come out of hiding. At some time he would still be able to appear here, and I considered it necessary, in every locality from which the enemy had fled, to establish immediately local authorities under my government. On entering the town I met Cooley, who was accompanied by the mayor of Dodeman and the members of the municipal council. We pass on foot through the streets of Bayeux. At the sight of General de Gaulle, the inhabitants seem to be in a daze, and then suddenly there are enthusiastic shouts, many crying with joy. People run out of their houses. Follow me. This procession moves in an atmosphere of extraordinary excitement. Children surround me, women smile and weep, men hold out their hands to me. And we walk together, overwhelmed, filled with a sense of brotherly closeness, proud and happy that the hopes of a nation are rising from the black depths of the abyss. In the sous-prefecture, in the room where Marshal Petain's portrait hung an hour ago, the sous-prefect Rochat places himself at my disposal, later replaced by Raymond Triboulette. All the officials gather to greet me. The first to receive me is Bishop Picot, whose diocese includes Bayeux and Lisieux, and the people have already gathered in the square. I'm heading there. I want to make a speech. Maurice Schumann announces my speech with the traditional words honor and homeland. This is General de Gaulle speaking. And then, for the first time after 4 years of terrible trials, the French gathered in the square heard the head of the French government saying that the enemy is the enemy, that it is the duty of the French to fight, and that France will also win. In essence, was this not a national revolution? Then I went to Isigny, a severely damaged village where the bodies of the dead were still being recovered from under the rubble. Amidst the ruins, the inhabitants gave me an honourable welcome. They gathered in front of the bomb-damaged monument to the victims of the First War. I addressed them. We were united in heart, and above the smoking ruins we lifted our faith and our hope to the sky. Last I visited the fishing village of Hrankum, also badly destroyed. On the way, I greeted Allied military detachments going to the front or returning from there, as well as detachments of our internal forces. Some of them rendered efficient assistance in the landing. By nightfall, we had arrived back at Corcel, then headed for the shore and returned to the ship. It was only a few hours later that we reached the open sea, as German planes and patrol destroyers attacked our ships anchored close together, and they were ordered to stand by. On the morning of June 15th, we arrived at Portsmouth, and I parted company with the combatant. On the previous day, as we approached the coast of France, I had presented the captain with the military cross, which I had awarded to his glorious ship. Shortly thereafter, the counter-destroyer combatant was sunk by the enemy. The proof was received in the metropolis. As well as in the Empire, the French people had clearly shown to whom they entrusted the duty of leading them. On the afternoon of June 15th, Eden came to see me at Carlton Gardens. He already knew everything that had happened in Bayeux, and the news agencies had reported it. In Eden's opinion, Roosevelt was only waiting for my trip to Washington to reconsider his positions. Expressing his regret that the French government had not agreed to act in the manner which London had advised us to follow, Eden now proposed to work out with Vienna a draft agreement, which he himself would submit to Washington. And he expected that this draft would be signed simultaneously by the French, the British, and the Americans. This way I considered acceptable and told Eden so. I then wrote to Churchill, wishing to pour healing balm on the wound he himself had inflicted. Churchill immediately replied to me and told me how he grieved that French-English cooperation cannot now be established on a different, better basis, and meanwhile, and in times of prosperity of France, and in its Black Year, he proved his sincere friendship to her. He believes that my stay in London will afford an opportunity of reaching an agreement. It now remains only to hope that this was not the last opportunity. The Prime Minister ended his letter by wishing that my future personal meetings with President Roosevelt would enable France to establish with the United States the good relations which constitute our heritage. Churchill assured me that he himself would help us in this endeavour. June 16th in the evening I flew to Algeria and arrived there the next day. Immediately I was told in great detail about the happy events that had taken place in Italy. On the very day I went to London, the advancing Allied forces had won a major victory. In particular, our Expeditionary Corps, having broken through the fortified positions of the enemy at Carigliano, opened the road to Rome. The French, Americans and British entered the city on June 5th. The military successes of the Allies had their effect. King Victor Emmanuel transferred power to his son. Badoglio resigned. Bonomi formed a new cabinet at Salerno, eager to see our victorious troops and to determine on the spot the significance of these changes. I left for Italy on June 27th. First of all, a halt at Naples. The Couve de Merville introduced me to Prunas, Secretary General of the Italian Foreign Office. This high official conveyed to me the greetings of his government, still at Salerno. I asked him to inform Bonomi of my desire to establish relations with him through the Couve de Merville. The President of the Council of Ministers replied to me by a letter informing me that he accepted my proposal with satisfaction. I then inspected our front troops, talked with June, Wilson, Alexander and Clark. Finally left for Rome, stopping there at the Palazzo Farnese, a sign that France is again taking possession of her former residence. June 30th visit of the Pope. The Holy See, by its perennial caution, had hitherto kept extremely discreet in regard to battling France and afterward to the Algerian government. Monsignor Valerio Valeri, who in 1940 had been papal nucifer in Paris, performed the same duties in Vichy for Pétain, and in the Vatican Pétain's representative was Léon Bérard. And yet we never ceased to inform the head of the Apostolic Church of our aims and feelings, and, incidentally, found in his entourage effective sympathy for us in particular, on the part of the worthy Cardinal Tisserand. We knew that, for the Pope, the defeat of Hitler and the collapse of his system were desirable, and we endeavoured to establish relations with him at the earliest opportunity. On June 4th, while the battle was still going on in Rome, Major de Panafia and Lieutenant Villazard delivered to Cardinal Tisserand a letter written by General de Gaulle to Pope Pius XII. On June 15th, the Pope replied to me, and so on June 30th, I went to the audience which he had deigned to grant me. At the Vatican I was received first of all by the Secretary of State, Cardinal Maglain, gravely ill. Already doomed, he was willing to get out of bed to talk to me. From age to age Rome has watched with majestic calm, but with unflagging attention the flow of men and events at the foot of its walls. Now the Church, fearless and compassionate, and also very knowledgeable, watches the ebb and flow of military events. Monsignor Malone was confident that the Allies would be victorious, and he was chiefly interested in the consequences of the war. As far as France was concerned, he counted on the disappearance of Vichy, and said that in fact he already saw me as the head of the French government. He hoped that the change of regime would take place without serious upheaval, especially for the French Church. I pointed out to the Cardinal that this was in accordance with the intentions of the government of the Republic, although some circles of the French clergy had taken such a position towards him that tomorrow he would not easily be able to come to terms with them. When it came to the future of Europe after the defeat of the Reich and the rise of the Soviets, I said that I considered the restoration of France's internal and external position a condition for a new European equilibrium. I asked the Vatican to help her with its great influence. The Holy Father received me. He met me favourably, spoke very simply, but behind this simplicity one can feel a remarkable power of thinking and responsiveness. Pius XII judges everything from a point of view that elevates him above people, their affairs and strife. But he understands the cost of these strife and shares their suffering. It is felt that the supernatural burden which is laid upon him alone in the whole world weighs upon his soul, but he bears the burden indefatigably, is firmly convinced of the good purposes of his mission, and knows the way to attain them. From his sources of information he knows everything about the drama that is shaking the world, and he thinks a great deal about it. His perceptive thought centers on the possible consequences of war when the waves of two ideologies, communism and nationalism, collide in a large part of the globe. His inspired eye revealed to him that only faith, hope, and Christian charity can overcome this storm, even if they are permanently swamped by the menacing ramparts. In his conviction, everything depends on the politics of the Church, on its actions, on the language it speaks, on the way it is led. That is why the shepherd of the Catholic Church leaves the leadership of this area of activity to himself personally and displays in it the valuable qualities with which God has endowed him: a strong will, a bright mind and eloquence. Pious, compassionate and prudent in the highest sense of the word, this is how this bishop and sovereign appeared to me, inspiring me with deep respect. We talked about the people of the Catholic Church, whose fate was being decided at that moment. The Pope believes that Catholicism in France is at first threatened only by its own troubles. He thought it quite possible that, in spite of all the trials our country had endured, she would still play a major role again in a world where so many moral values had been trampled on, but she was also in danger of becoming again the scene of the strife that had too often undermined her strength. Most of all, he was now worried about Germany, which for many reasons was very dear to him. Unhappy nation. How much they will have to suffer, he said. He foresaw a long turmoil in Italy, but it did not inspire him with much alarm. Perhaps he thought that after the defeat of fascism and the fall of the monarchy, the Catholic Church, which enjoyed great moral authority in that country, would be the only force in it that would ensure order and unity. Such a prospect seemed to please him, and he spoke well of it. As I listened to his judgments about the future, I thought of what I had recently been told by eyewitnesses yesterday afternoon. As soon as the battle was over, a great crowd rushed in unanimous gusts into St. Peter's Square and cheered the Pope, as if he were the Lord of Rome, saved from its enemies and the backbone of Italy. But the Holy Father was alarmed by the advance of the Soviets, whose troops were already on Polish soil, and tomorrow would occupy all of Central Europe. In conversation, he mentioned what was happening in Galicia, where persecution of believers and priests had begun in the rear of the Red Army. He believed that Christianity would have to endure severe trials. In his opinion, only a close alliance of European states inspired by Catholicism, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Belgium, and Portugal could prevent the danger. I guessed that the creation of such an alliance was the great plan of Pope Pius XII. Our conversation ended. He gave me his blessing. I left. When I went to the audience and now, when I returned from it, near the Vatican crowded a crowd of Romans, loud cries of sympathy for me. I visited St. Louis Church, where I was received by Monsignor Bouquin, visited the Medici Villa, where the hopes of French art were soon to blossom again, and then received our colony. Since 1940 it had, for reasons quite understandable, consisted of members of monastic orders. All were gathered. Cardinal Tisserand introduced each one to me. Whatever our previous differences, we were all now lifted by the same joyous excitement. The pride of victory united men who could have been divided by the bitterness of defeat. The unity of the French was already evident, so conspicuous that it was impossible not to notice it, just as it was impossible not to see the sun in the sky on a clear day. The President of the United States had also to recognize it. In order that this turn could be attributed to new events, he invited me to Washington with increased insistence. When I was in London, Admiral Pienaar appeared again. Roosevelt instructed him to inform me of the dates he considered convenient for my trip. June 11th, I was visited at Carlton Gardens by General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, who was sent to me by his chief, who had not yet returned from Normandy, and General Marshall, who was then in London. Bedell Smith literally begged me to agree to a meeting with the President, because the military command needs to know as soon as possible what decisions have been made in the question of administrative cooperation in France. In Algeria, the same insistence was shown by Selden Chapin, who was temporarily filling in for Ambassador Wilson. Finally, I knew that the Allied offensive on French territory would be launched in August. If there was any possibility of coming to any practical agreement, there was no time to lose. Having seriously discussed the matter with the government, I decided to go to Washington. But just as I had done on my trip to London, when I wished to show that we were not going to ask for anything or negotiate anything, none of the ministers accompanied me. The purpose of the interviews between General de Gaulle and President Roosevelt would be only mutual information on world problems concerning both sides. Moreover, my visit to the United States at a decisive period of the war may be interpreted as a token of France's appreciation of American aid, and as proof of the undying friendship between the French people and the people of this allied country. If, as a result of our conversations at the White House, the American government decides to enter into negotiations with the French government on the relations between the Allied forces and our administration, let it conduct them in the same manner as the British government, through the usual diplomatic channels. On this basis, the State Department and our ambassador jointly worked out a program for my stay in the United States. It was agreed that in Washington I would be in all respects the guest of the President and government of the United States. This would be sufficient to refute the sensational reports and articles which had already endeavored to portray the matter as if I were going to America, not as an invitee but as a petitioner. On the other hand, Canada was also calling me, and so cordially that I instructed our delegate in Ottawa, Gabriel Bonneau, to discuss with the Mackenzie King government the details of my trip to this dear and courageous country. Having flown in an airplane which the President of the United States had kindly sent for me, I arrived in Washington, accompanied by Chapin, on the afternoon of July 6th. I was accompanied by Betoir, Paliuski, Rancourt, Paris, Bobe and Tixot. On the threshold of the White House I was met, smiling affably, by Franklin Roosevelt. Next to him was Cordell Hall. After tea, the President and I had a long conversation face to face. We had the same conversations with him for the next 2 days. I was placed in the Blair House, a curious old building which the American government usually sets aside for its guests. the breakfast at the White House, which took place in a solemn but cordial atmosphere, the luncheon at the Secretary of State's, the luncheon at the Secretary of War's, the reception which I gave at our embassy, its temporary residence. As the building in which the French embassy has been and will hereafter be housed is still closed to us, all these festivities served as occasions for meetings and conversations with political and military leaders, associates of the President. These are his closest aides, Cordell Hall, who performs his difficult task with great conscientiousness and generosity of heart. He is probably somewhat embarrassed by his lack of familiarity with foreign countries and by the President's interference in his field of activity. Patterson and Forrestal, who in their ministerial positions have learned the psychology of the masters of vast industrial enterprises, for their departments have in 3 years grown monstrously large and absorb much of America's resources, talents, and ambitions. Morgenthau is a great man of the world. This staff is a tightly knit unit which, because of the character of each of its members and Roosevelt's flamboyant personality, does not credit itself with brilliant talents, but is undoubtedly on top of its duties. Of course, I did not fail to visit the tomb of the unknown soldier in lovely Arlington Park. I visited General Pershing, who is living out his last days in a military hospital with stately composure. To honor the memory of George Washington, I made a pilgrimage to Mount Vernon. At Blair House I received many prominent persons and above all Henry Wallace, Vice President of the United States, who dreams of social justice and would have us win for the common man, and Padilla, Foreign Minister of Mexico, who was then in Washington. At the residence of our missions I met the French diplomatic staff, which was headed by Henry Oppenot, then General de Saint. Didier Admiral Fenard and Colonel Luget introduced me to our officers. Before leaving Washington, I addressed a press conference and spoke to many of the journalists who had gathered to listen and question me. During the 5 days I spent in the capital of the United States, I was pleased to see the wave of confidence in US rising, taking hold of the color of American society, and I concluded that optimism is a good means of winning hearts. One must only possess it. President Roosevelt certainly has it. In our conversations he was careful not to touch on any burning issues, but painted with a broad brush the political goals he hoped to achieve through victory. His aspirations seemed grandiose to me, but inspired anxiety for the fate of Europe and France. The President considers the isolationism of the United States a great mistake, now a thing of the past. But he rushes from one extreme to the other, and would like to establish a system of permanent intervention through international laws. He believes that a 4-member directory America, Soviet Russia, China, and England will settle the problems of the whole world. A parliament of the United Nations would give the power of the Big Four a democratic appearance. But in order not to give at the disposal of 3 of these powers almost the entire globe, this organization, in his opinion, would have to require that in various countries of the world were arranged bases of American armed forces, and some of them should be located on French territory. Roosevelt hoped thus to involve the USSR in an association which would restrain her ambitious aspirations and within which America could gather her clientele. He knows that of the 4 great powers, Chiang Kai-shek's China needs his assistance, and England, for fear of losing her dominions, must agree to his policy. As for the host of medium and small nations, America will have the opportunity to influence them by giving them material aid. Finally, the right of nations to control their own destiny, the support given by Washington, the presence of American bases, will give birth to new sovereign states in Africa, in Asia, in Melanesia, which will increase the number of countries indebted to the United States. In the light of his detailed perspectives, even the important questions concerning Europe, namely, the fate of Germany, the fate of the Pribilonian, Danubian and Balkan countries, the future of Italy seem to him secondary. For the sake of their happy resolution, Roosevelt will not agree to sacrifice the gigantic plans which he dreams to realize. Roosevelt draws me his plans. I listen to him and think how typical of people idealism covers the desire for power. The President, however, does not present his thoughts like a professor developing certain points or like a politician inflaming passions and vested interests. He paints with light, delicate strokes. They paint so well that it is difficult to object strongly to this artist, this seducer. I answer him, however, that in my judgment such a plan could threaten the West with great dangers. Roosevelt considers Western Europe a secondary value, and does he not thereby undermine the cause he wishes to serve, the cause of civilization? Will it be necessary, to the detriment of the Polish, Baltic, Danube and Balkan countries, to give Soviet Russia advantages that threaten the general equilibrium in order to win the Soviets to his side? Who will guarantee that China, after passing through the severe trials in which its nationalism is being forged, will remain as it is now? I am the first to say and think that the powers holding the colonies should give up direct rule over them and establish there a regime of association. But is it not true that the liberation movement must not be directed against these powers? Otherwise it will arouse in the unorganized masses a hatred of foreigners and anarchy dangerous to the whole world. It is necessary to revive the West, I said to President Roosevelt. If it recovers, the rest of the world will willy-nilly take it as a model. And Western Europe, in spite of its strife, is extremely important to the West. What in it will replace the valor, the strength, the radiance of the culture of the ancient peoples? This is above all true of France, for of all the great European nations she alone has been, is, and always will be your ally. I know that you are preparing to give her material aid precious to her, but she must also regain her strength in the sphere of politics, her confidence in herself, and therefore her role. How can this be possible if she is kept out of the great world decisions, if she loses her African and Asiatic possessions, if the war is concluded in a way that indoctrinates her with the psychology of the vanquished? Roosevelt, with his deep intelligence, understands these considerations. He has, moreover, a truly tender affection for France, of which he has in his own time made up his mind. But it is because of this heartfelt inclination that he harbours deep down in his heart a disappointment and anger that the defeat of France has not shaken so many Frenchmen, particularly those with whom he was personally acquainted. He told me this very simply. As for the future of France, he has little faith in talk of renewing our regime. He described to me with bitterness the heavy feeling of political disintegration he had witnessed in our country. You know, I couldn't remember the name of this or that occasional head of the French government the President of the United States told me. Now you are our guest, and you see how my country welcomes you. But will you stay in your seat when the tragedy is over? It would be easy, but also futile, to remind Roosevelt that America's deliberate insularity played no small part in our decline in spirit after World War I, and then in the vicissitudes of our country's fortunes at the outbreak of World War II. I might also point out to him that his stance on General de Gaulle and fighting France was very conducive to the mood of attentism held by much of our elite, and that Roosevelt's stance favoured in advance the return of the French nation to the very muddle of politics that he rightly condemns. Listening to the American president, I was finally convinced that in business relations between two nations, logic and feeling mean very little in comparison with real power, that he who can grasp and hold what he has seized is valued, and if France is to regain her former position, she must rely only on herself. I shared my thought with Roosevelt. He smiled and concluded our conversation by remarking, "We will do what we can. But who better than the French people themselves can serve France? In this no one can replace him." Our conversations were over. They took place in Roosevelt's office, near a table cluttered with a lot of outlandish things, souvenirs, badges, fetishes that bring happiness. I say goodbye and leave. The president, who is wheeled in an armchair, sees me off a little. A door is open on the gallery. "That's my pool over there." "I swim in it," said Roosevelt, as if defying his affliction. Before leaving Washington, I asked him to give him a small submarine, a mechanical marvel that had been created at the Bizerte arsenal. He thanked me warmly in a short letter and sent me his picture to General de Gaulle, my friend. Later, however, A certain anonymous person sent me a photocopy of a letter Roosevelt wrote a week after my departure to Congressman Joseph Clark Baldwin. The president vaguely mentions in his letter some American negotiations unknown to me concerning the French enterprise Transatlantic General Company, and warns the addressee that I should know nothing about it. Let them be careful, because if de Gaulle is in the know, he will certainly suspend the director of the company. In this letter, Roosevelt also gives an assessment of my person and our conversations with him. I and de Gaulle, he writes, only in general terms considered contemporary topics. However, we touched in more detail on the future of France, its colonies, ensuring peace, etc. When it comes to the problems of the future, he seems very accommodating as long as France is treated as a world power. He is very sensitive to everything that concerns the prestige of France, but I think he is just selfish. I never got to find out whether Franklin Roosevelt thought that in matters concerning France Charles de Gaulle was selfish in the interests of France or in his own self-interest. On July 10th, I was passing through New York, very briefly. In order not to give occasion for popular demonstrations, which 3 months before the presidential election might seem directed against the president's former policy, it was decided that I should show myself less to the public. Especially since Governor Dewey of New York was also a presidential candidate, Roosevelt's running mate. Nevertheless, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, filled with ebullient friendly feelings for France, received me with great pomp in the City Hall, and there was a large crowd of people near it. The mayor and I then toured the city. I laid the Lorraine Cross on the Lafayette Monument. I visited our Consulate General, which was headed by Garin de Beaumont. I then went to the France Forever Society, which united a large number of Frenchmen and Americans who supported our struggle. Henry Torres delivered there an address of welcome, in which he expressed the sentiments of all the members of the society. At the Waldorf Astoria, the French colony of New York, and delegates who came from other neighborhoods were assembled. I came to join them. Among the assembled Frenchmen, many had hitherto regarded General de Gaulle with great reticence. Some had even assiduously criticized him, and indeed insulted him. But this evening I was greeted with extraordinary warmth, as it seemed that all differences of opinion had disappeared. Everything proved that in the great controversy, of which France was the subject, the victory was decidedly on her side. We were convinced of this also in Canada, where the people were so anxious to give us proof of their unanimity with us. First of all, we went to Quebec City, and there I felt a wave of pride for the French flood over me. But it was soon overtaken by a wave of disappointing sorrow, both of which came from the distant times of history. We then proceeded, accompanied by Ambassador General Vanier, to Ottawa. At the airfield we were met by Prime Minister Mackenzie King. It was a pleasure to see again this worthy, strong and simple man, a head of government, who has given all his authority and experience to the cause of the service of liberty. Canada has followed him, and its merit is all the greater because its population consists of two peoples, coexisting but not intermingling, and the more so because the war is far from Canada and its interests are not directly affected here. Under the influence of its government, the country has now launched a strong military effort. Canada has fielded numerous contingents of high fighting qualities, has given large troop formations, ship crews incorporated in the English Navy, squadrons of airplanes incorporated in the English Air Force. Much of the Allied war material is manufactured in Canada. Even the laboratories and factories of Canada are engaged in scientific research and practical experiments, which were soon to lead to the manufacture of the atomic bomb. I was given a secret report on the outstanding achievements of French scientists Pierre Auger, Jules Gironès, and Bertrand Goldsmith, who, with my permission, had joined the Allied groups dedicated to this work worthy of the apocalypse. But compared to what happened during the First World War, Canada's action this time is national in character. For the state and for the people, this independence is like a new stage of development, which makes ministers, MPs, bureaucrats, and all citizens proud. I was told this by Mackenzie King, and then by his chief colleague Louis Saint Laurent, and I was told clearly of Canada's intention to help the reconstruction of France if possible. During my stay in Canada, I was the guest of Count Athlone, Governor-General of Canada, and his wife Princess Alice, aunt of King George VI. They received me with unforgettable cordiality and invited many distinguished persons to their house to introduce them to me. Many hours were taken up by official conversations, audiences that I had to give, a solemn ceremony at the monument to the citizens of Ottawa, who died in the First World War, an inspection trip to the French pilots who were trained in the vicinity of the city, a dinner arranged in my honor by the Canadian government, a press conference. A speech still had to make one in response to the greetings of St. Laurent. I made that speech before members of Parliament, before ministers, senior officials, and the diplomatic corps. Speaking of the importance that international cooperation, especially cooperation in the West, should have for the cause of peace, which is already at hand, I pointed out that my country, too, wanted to contribute to the common treasury, and I ended my speech with the following words: France is convinced that with her there will be all peoples who believe in her. She is convinced that Canada will be foremost among them. On July 12th, I arrived in Montreal and was thrilled by the enthusiastic welcome I received there. After a reception at City Hall and the laying of wreaths at the two monuments to the victims of the war, the Canadians and the French, I made a speech to the immense crowd assembled in Dominion Square and its adjoining streets. Adhemar Reynaud, mayor of the city, shouted to his fellow citizens, showed General de Gaulle that Montreal is the second French city in the world. No words can describe the storm of jubilation, the boisterous cheers that erupted on all sides. In the evening, the airplane took us away from Canada. On July 13th, we were already in Algeria. And then I received the text of the declaration issued the day before by the American government. The United States, it said, recognizes that the French Committee of National Liberation has the right to administer France. Immediately, the State Department negotiated with Oppenot and Alphen concerning an agreement for administrative cooperation in the liberated territory. For their part, Eden and Vienna worked out satisfactory terms of cooperation. Early in August, Algeria, Washington, and London agreed on the wording of the agreement. What was adopted was remarkably similar to what we had proposed a year before. The Provisional Government of the French Republic, that was the name used in the agreement. It was stated without qualification that it alone was the public authority, that it alone created the necessary organs for communication with the Allied forces, that it alone could place at the disposal of the military command the services which the command requested, that it alone had the right to issue money in France and to supply, in exchange for pounds sterling and dollars, American and British troops on French territory. Let the great battle for France unfold. Let the Allied armies, side by side with our army and assisted by our internal forces, move from Normandy to Paris and march up the valley of the Rhône, up the river. Let a nation be liberated from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rhine, which for 1,000 and 1,500 years no storms, not even the one now raging, could deprive of its sovereignty and wrest from its hands its last weapon. We shall give France back her independence, her empire and her sword.